Hi there. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Brenna Wynn Greer, who's Associate Professor of History at Wellesley College. She's a historian of race, gender, and culture in the 20th century in the US, and she explores historical connections between capitalism, social movements, and visual culture, and she teaches topics in US and African American history. Her first book represented the Black image makers who reimagined African American citizenship, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2019. It examines the historical circumstances that made the media representation of Black citizenship good business in the post-World War II era. Brenna is a recipient of several teaching awards and major fellowships, and she's working on her second book, Issues of Color, a cultural and business history of post-World War II Black magazine publishing industry. The title of her lecture today is African Americans and the Photographic Seat of Honor. Thank you, Dr. Greer. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I will hand over to you now.
Thank you so much. I just realized when you said it that you're much later in the day than I am. And so I want to make sure that I honor the fact that people are in different time zones. It's weird not to be able to see you, but I will share my screen in a moment. But I did really want to thank the organizers for organizing this. It's very clear to me from email exchanges and then from looking at the beautiful website and the people who are presenting that this is a lot of work. And I'm really honored to be included in this first round. For a myriad of reasons, I've been off track in terms of my interest in photography for a while. So this was a really nice way to be able to get back into the conversation. And so what I'm going to do today is bring you along on my first foray into some questions that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. And specifically, I want to talk about images or photographs that commemorate historical Black figures. But before I do that, I want to say a couple of things just to set you up for what I'm going to say. So first, as Tom discussed, this has been a really interesting week, and I certainly don't want to offend anyone on the call, but it has been, when I accepted this invitation, it never occurred to me that I'd be doing it during this week and that I would be prepping for it during this week. And that has affected my presentation. I can tell there's more cynicism, quite a bit more cynicism in it. And that may not be something that you need right now. I certainly don't want anyone to go away, but I feel obligated to tell you that. As Tom said, I've felt all week like, what am I doing? Why am I focusing on this? This is frivolous. Why do I even care? Do I care? But as Tom also said, really actually think part of the reason that my presentation kind of took the turn that it did is because I think what I have to talk about is important. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. I should also say that some of the images that I'm going to share are graphic and upsetting, and I will alert you. I will do my best to alert you before I do that so that you can turn away if you want to. I completely understand, again, that may not be something that you need right now. So, and then the last thing I will say is that this truly is my first foray into what I'm doing here. And so I welcome criticisms, contributions, questions, anything during the Q&A, because I would love to have some help in terms of developing this. So again, as I said, I want to focus on the meaning of photographs that celebrate Black historical figures, and more pressingly about if and how they perform in the present day to shape conceptions of and towards Black protest. And so my focus is going to be more of on a collective and cumulative effect of this broader archive versus one photograph. And before I get going, like I said, I want to also warn you that there'll be some upsetting images and that this is a very US-centric focus, which is just limitations of myself, not limitations of the question. And again, I really encourage anyone to challenge me. All right, so with that said, I want to refer back to the lecture from last month, which I was fortunate to hear, and I hope you were too. And during this lecture, Sean Michelle Smith discussed artist Carrie Mae Weems's work, Constructing History, for which Weems worked with her students to produce photographs that reconstructed key moments of the 1960s, which included assassinations of activists and political leaders. And Weems explicitly acknowledged her students as collaborators. But it was very clear that in the collaboration, I went and watched the video afterwards, Weems is the indisputable creator and director, which is fine. My talk today, however, is very much directed by my students. It is their observations, their insights, their questions, their concerns, in addition to my concerns and hopes for them, that has finally pushed me to start down this path. So with that, I don't think it's news for this crowd that Black Americans' experiences, contributions, complexities, and humanity have consistently been and continue to be suppressed, distorted, and erased. And this is something that I'm thinking about a lot this week, in favor of simpler, triumphant, and racist national histories, and the systemic racism that privileges white Americans and thrives on those national histories. And since its arrival in the United States, photography has been central to these efforts. Again, no surprise to anyone here. But in efforts to recognize and demonstrate that relationship, our focus tends to settle on exploitative photographs of enslaved Blacks, or photographs that have been taken or used to advance scientific racism, lynching photographs, and there are photographs that are criminalizing Black people. So again, today I'm going to be locked in on photographs commemorating Black historical actors. So why? Well, as a nation, we consistently rely on a particular set of Black figures to represent and teach Black history in the United States. And I say this as someone who teaches Black history and then also is besieged during Black History Month to do presentations. And so by way of demonstration, I want to just show a couple of collages. I always do Google image searches of Black History Month. I do them every once in a while, and these are different images. I put them together in their own collage, but these are the different collages that come up or came up on one of my searches. And then here's another set, and I really want you to notice that they're collage images. And another one. The other thing I would point out is that whoever is focused, these are typically represented in black and white, which is something that I think actually deadens the photographs in that it makes them seem older and less relevant in some ways, at least to my students, to younger viewers. But the bigger point is you can see a lot of repetition of the figures that are in these collages. And that's my point. And to represent, or to emphasize how representative a few key figures, few iconic figures are, I decided to do an image search of other dedicated history months. And I was really surprised to find out that no people come up. These are screenshots from when I did that. Right? There's no people. Well, here there are some people, but it's largely just graphics, you know, with Asian American and Pacific Islander logos or whatever. So that was really telling to me that this is unique in how we use a couple of figures to represent all of Black history and a race. And so one of the things that I think is important about that is the iconicity of these Black figures. I think, not the importance, but the iconicity is firmly rooted in the iconic photographs of them, some of which many of them which they have engineered. And because the majority of the Black historical icons we celebrate were freedom fighters of some sort, their photographs, I think, shape general understanding of and attitudes towards Black activism, particularly since they generally only circulate only in educational spaces, which could be museums, libraries, but then the classroom. In the media, when there's a news event, such as when Donald Trump implied that Frederick Douglass was still alive, or just through the internet, through random searches like I did. So, and in the present day, I fear that these images may frustrate rather than further racial equality and justice, which I mean to demonstrate has everything to do with the Black subjects, how they've arranged themselves in these photographs. So to quote Professor Smith, she has pointed out that the reading of a photograph is, of course, dependent on who's viewing the photographs, to what purposes, when, and in what cultural context. And this being the case, I argue that the visual landscape, technologies, codes, and grammar of today deny or distract from past intents, functions, and meanings of photographic images that picture notable Black Americans. And many of them are sitting down. And this, I think, attenuates their ability to redefine Blackness or to convey Black history in manners that are useful to our present moment, or to advance a liberating Black politics. So I'm going to say, I should say, before I move on, that you're going to notice that I am borrowing from and building off a number of scholars whose work has been really important in my work and proven to be very productive in the classroom. And so while putting this together, a nice thing about it was that I started to feel real companionship. I started to think of this as like a love letter to these scholars and their work. Put that over here away from the cynicism that you may hear. So with that, I want to get started. So less than 2 minutes ago, I said to you that I'm going to focus on a collective of images, except when it comes to this photograph. Anyone who knows my work at all is likely aware that for the entirety of my scholarly career, I have been obsessed with this particular photograph of Rosa Parks, who's widely known as the mother of the civil rights movement. And as I'm sure many of you know, Parks's arrest in December of 1955 for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a bus sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, in which Blacks in Montgomery, Alabama boycotted the segregated city buses for 381 days. And this photo was taken on December 21st, 1956, the day that Black Montgomeryans ceased their boycott of the buses following the Supreme Court's confirmation that segregated buses were unconstitutional. What few people know, though, is that this photo was 100% staged. It represents a collaboration, a partnership between Parks and the press. And so to create this scene, Parks took a seat by herself toward the front of the bus, as you see here, and she gazed out the window in a deliberate effort to evoke her supposed calm on the day of her arrest a year early. In fact, many think this photograph was taken the day of her arrest, in part because of the white man seated behind her. But he, in fact, was a reporter out of Atlanta who was among the group that sought Rosa Parks out that morning. And as he explained later, it was his role to take the seat behind Parks and appear to play the role of the, quote, sullen white segregationist and appear as a random passenger. And then this visual arrangement indicated and dramatized the bus's new status as a desegregated space. And so once Parks and Chris were in place, an unidentified United Press photographer took up position at the front of the bus, seemingly on the stairs, and took what became and remains the most iconic photograph of Rosa Parks. And then the following week, that image ran in Time magazine, which at the time was the #1 news magazine. And so this photograph could not have entered a more mainstream media space. And the extreme crop of the picture frames Chris and Parks in a way that emphasizes their proximity, and by extension, then the captions claim that, quote, Jim Crow will never be quite the same. And then the image entered the Black press, picked up by Jet magazine, which had a circulation of 400,000 at the time, and then the NAACP's official organ, the Crisis, which was the NAACP at that time being the largest civil rights organization in the country. So over the past 4 decades, historians have repeatedly demonstrated that Rosa Parks was a lifelong activist who doggedly fought for African-American civil rights and against sexual violence. But you would never suspect as much from looking at this photograph, right? This image of Parks is the culminating act in her year-long performance as a lady, as what Martin Berger has referred to as the perfect victim, right? A lady wronged and an accidental activist, rather than what she really was, what she actually was a radical combatant of Jim Crow. And so from the 1950s to this very moment, this photograph of Parks has been, bar none, the most popular and most widely circulated. Indeed, as cultural studies scholar Nicole Fleetwood has determined, the image is, quote, one of the most reproduced images of the 20th century. which is a problem in my mind, because as the stickiest representation of Parks, this image visually substantiates and thus perpetuates the popular narrative of her as a genteel and tired woman who broke character when she took a stand by sitting down, which obscures information that is essential to understanding and thus learning from one of, if not the most successful social movement in US history. Information that I think could prove useful now. Now, as depicted here, Parks looks regal, yes. She does not look radical, despite that she is sitting in front of a white man, and more impressively, she has harnessed the white media to the cause. But ripped from context, this photograph is a study in containment. In it, Parks's dress, comportment, and countenance all work to visually confine her within the frame, and the large winter coat that she wears appears to both wrap her up and weigh her down. The hair that would not fit under her hat is disciplined in a large but tidy bun. Parks sits straight up with her hands clasped in her lap. Her facial expression contributes to a picture of quietude. Soberly, she stares out the window with her mouth firmly closed. She embodies silence. And her relation to the camera contributes to an image of her as non-threatening, because as she's looking out the window, her face is turned away from the photographer and the only other person visible in the photograph, the white man seated behind her. Consequently, she does not engage or confront the viewer or anyone in her visible context. So this photographic image, which incidentally Parks referred to as her symbol shot, speaking to its outsized role as representative of her and her historical significance, this image reflects and indeed captures Parks engaged in a politics of image that was politically expedient for the task at hand to advance Black civil rights, and of course, to alleviate immediate suffering, a motivation we should grant every past actor without judgment, but curiosity. So having great knowledge of Parks, nonviolence, the civil rights movement, and its goals, I read this photograph as a triumphant representational event. But as one who has been teaching and presenting on US and civil rights history for 2 decades, I'm here to tell you that the vast majority of Americans across race lines, across generations, are woefully uninformed, uneducated about the Black freedom struggle, which then results in a general perception of this as an image of a peaceful, if pensive, polite, and even passive woman, a safe Black actor. Now, of course, it's important to understand that in the context of the civil rights movement, passive and peaceful was an appearance affected through nonviolent direct action, not the reality, given that a primary purpose of nonviolent direct action was to manipulate whites and specifically to provoke white violence, which it very much did. No doubt popularity of Parks's symbol shot, or the iconicity of it, stems in part from its composition and function as visual storytelling, no matter if the story is true. However, I contend that its popularity primarily rests in its function as a representation of benign Blackness and a celebration of activism that people assume is rooted in a politics of respectability, which precludes violence and is therefore less scary and more palatable to non-Blacks, especially whites. As indicated above, Parks's physical comportment is essential to this non-threatening image of Blackness. Most essential, she is seated, she is silent, and she is still. Of course, everyone is silenced and immobilized by the photographic medium, but they don't always appear as such. In life, Parks was a vocal and very visibly active and mobile in her activism. And this photograph, which both documents and celebrates a civil rights victory linked to her protest, it visually and ironically arrests her again. So what? Well, it's my view that in its reign as a civil rights image, this photograph of confined Blackness has become a logo or a brand image that not only defines, but also markets polite protest or restrained Black protest as good protest. Am I disparaging peaceful protest or nonviolent direct action? Which is important to say are not the same thing? Of course not. Do I think such protests may be insufficient in the current Black freedom struggle? 100%. Having dwelled on the Parks symbol shot, the problem that I see is much bigger than this one photograph, because this photograph belongs to an archive of what I think of as arresting, honorific, and iconic photographs of historical Black figures. And I use arresting here not to mark these photographs as striking or attention-grabbing, although I don't deny that, but rather to classify them as photographs that visually constrain their subjects. And more to the point, this photograph reflects a Black image politics that, as demonstrated by scholars who may be online, can be traced to photography's beginning. And that, of course, then brings us to Frederick Douglass, who, as a formerly enslaved man, rose to become an internationally renowned abolitionist and orator who moved through rarefied white spaces as a respected figure. Now, more than a century before Rosa Parks helped stage her most famous photograph, Douglass posed for his first self-portrait here. The year was 1841. Douglass was a fugitive slave, having escaped only 3 years earlier, and photography had arrived in the States only 2 years earlier in the form of the daguerreotype. Douglass seized on photography, promoting the technology through speeches and writing, and making use of it across its many developments until his death in 1895, and arguably even after his death. Now, thanks to the academic and public-facing work of historians and photography scholars, we know that Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century. And if you have not already done so, I strongly recommend getting your hands on this book, Picturing Frederick Douglass. It's a beautifully produced book that, in addition to great analytical essays, offers a catalog of the 168 photographs that the authors were able to identify of Douglass, which is a great thing to study. Now, over the past decade or so, a number of scholars on both sides of the pond have detailed and theorized about Douglass's embrace of photography as a means to produce a more perfect likeness, his words, with images of Blackness that challenge the racist images, attitudes, and institutions of his moment. Now, given the depth and quality of this work, it is pure folly for me to tread on the same ground. And yet, here I go. So notably, when Douglass sat for studio portraits, he did just that. He sat. Based on that catalog in Picturing Frederick Douglass and a thorough tour of the web, it appears that Douglass stood for only one studio portrait of those that are known. In sitting, he was completely adhering to convention. At the time, sitting was the pose recommended by photography experts for various reasons, and it was custom among the elite, members of the elite. So in combination with the finery that Douglass always sported when he was photographed, by sitting for his portraits, he projected an image of himself as also cultured, respectable, respected, and stately, according to contemporary notions, which was especially meaningful use and active representation at a time when people believed photographs to be objective and incapable of deception or inaccuracy. Not surprisingly, other Black men of the time grasped the significance of this as well, and perhaps they were instructed by the example of the image that Douglass provided. Another convention, photographic custom that Douglass followed was that he did not smile. And it's more accurate to say that he would not smile, even when, or perhaps especially when, he was facing the camera, which he rarely did. For Douglass, adopting this countenance was not a matter of convention, or not just a matter of convention. As Martha Cutter argues, of all those he might have chosen, quote, Douglass consciously selected an expression of ire. It's a look that my mother would describe as, damn it, I'll bite you, and my father would deem a try me expression. And he chose this expression lest his countenance undercut notions of him as a formidable man to be taken seriously. Again, it's important to note that not smiling in photographs was very much convention at the time. However, Douglass's lack of smile read, and I think reads differently, as the look of a man contemplating the future with past grievances in mind. Another figure of focus when it comes to African Americans' early use of photography, of course, is Sojourner Truth, an abolitionist and women's rights activist of the 19th century. She too recognized the value photography held for her as a formerly enslaved, illiterate Black women activist. Producing nowhere as many photographs as Douglass, Truth harnessed the medium to similar purposes, including most notably taking control of her own image. This studio portrait, which is said to be her favorite, when you look at it compared to Douglass's, it looks downright cluttered, right? Notably, Douglass's portraits are typically tightly cropped, such that he occupied the majority of the photograph's real estate, and as many were head and shoulders shots, props and furniture, if present, were not visible. Truth's photographs featured ornate settings and props such as flowers, books, letters, knitting materials, shawls, and reticules, evidence that her photographs had different work to do, particularly given the work that was being done by images beyond her control, such as this 1860 illustration of her preaching to a crowd, the members of which appear both fascinated and terrified of her. Beginning with Nell Irvin Painter, several have discussed how, as was true with Douglass, Truth's self-portraits defined her away from her former enslaved status and the stereotypes that went with that status. And with her props and her poses, she made claims to normative womanhood, thus fixing her gender, which was often questioned based on racist and sexist ideas that white men in particular attached to her height. She was almost 6 feet tall, her strength, the result of her work in and beyond slavery, and the fact that her way of travel was often walking, her Blackness, I don't think I have to say more, and of course, her activism. Notably, in some of her photographs, she is holding or next to reading material, which then visually denied her inability to read or write, but evidenced her literacy when it came to contemporary cultural currency and visual codes. Now, an important factor distinguishing Truth's photographs from Douglass's was her reliance on them as, quote, her chief and almost sole form of support. From the moment Douglass escaped slavery, he became the beneficiary of what we would now call crowdfunding across abolitionist circles in the States and Europe. Additionally, he earned a healthy living as an orator, newspaper publisher, and author, such that when he died, he's reported to have had a fortune between $100,000 to $300,000, which would make him a millionaire in today's dollars. Truth, as an illiterate and, to quote another scholar, uncouth, formerly enslaved woman, she did not enjoy such fortune, literally speaking. A fact made plain by the caption that she printed across the bottom of her photographs: "I sell the shadow to support the substance." Several scholars identify the caption as a slogan, which it is, and point to it as evidence of business and marketing savvy, self-fashioning and image control, and authorship. As Augusta Rohrbeck has explained, in addition to her copywriting her image, stamping this phrase on her portraits ensured that Truth profited from sale of her image. And the formats that she chose of carte visites and cabinet cards allowed her to reprint the products, or these print products, as occasions and finances required. Now, these interpretations of Truth's self-authored caption are both evident and convincing to me, but I also think that reading Truth's use of the phrase, "I sell the shadow to support the substance," as an act of empowerment denies what I view as the most evident reading. And I worry that, as Walter Johnson discusses in his article on agency, in our efforts to highlight the agency of marginalized groups, especially Blacks, we often cast their acts as empowered, resistant, and oppositional. I say this because I have never read the caption on Truth's portrait as a slogan, excuse me, or signifying phrase, although I think it is both. Not before I was a historian and not now. I've never been able to read it as anything but a statement of poverty and dependency, a confession and a concession. It confesses the image Truth offers, that it is empty. Whatever the viewer gets, it's a husk of a woman. Combining the photographic image and this text for the purpose of market exchange reads to me not as self-possession, but as dispossession. And if I may be so bold, my reading is especially significant, not because I'm a historian or a scholar, but because I'm a Black woman living in the United States, a nation in which Black people's citizenship, rights, liberty, and equality have never been fully or consistently granted, regardless of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, amendments to the Constitution, proclamations, emancipation, legislation, demonstrations, and even war. These portraits belong to those that are held out to me as ones that should inspire and empower me as an African American, as a Black woman, but they don't. Rather, as artifacts of the abolitionist movement, and thus slavery. It's been a hard week. And the shadow of a Black woman dependent on others, they depress me. That said, as a historian and an educator, I think these images are essential and incredibly instructive sources, at least they should be. And they document the incredible range and creativity of Truth's agency and her commitment as an activist. But for me, knowing the history, as is my job, only makes what I see worse. Compared to Douglass, Sojourner Truth stood up more in her photographs than he did. But the majority of extant photographs of her picture her sitting. And as I've already indicated, sitting was not a radical choice. As was true of not smiling, it was the complete photographic norm. In the visual grammar of painted portraits that shaped those norms, a seated pose conferred upon to the sitter the contemporary values of self-discipline, morality, propriety, sobriety, and dignity, which is to say, sitting for photographs did important work for a race relentlessly depicted as savage, undisciplined, infantile, stupid, and corrupt. But I question how much and what kind of work these photographic images did at the time. In discussing African Americans' early use of photography, we tend to focus on their use of photography and individual Black actors' use of the medium. And we view their photographs as moments of them defining themselves in their own image in manners that benefit the whole. At least that's the argument. But I think it's necessary to zoom out to consider their value and function beyond that one person and their agendas. We know that Douglass's and Truth's portraits traveled widely in abolitionist circles, but I want more on how they traveled and performed outside that context. For example, how did these studio portraits engineered by Black leaders and abolitionists to not only define Black people against stereotype, but as especially civilized and esteemed, characteristics that were and are raised white, how could these images land, perform, and read in the slave society of the South? Thanks to Douglass's extensive commentary on photography, we know that he considered the images of Blackness and Black masculinity he constructed and conveyed through photography as challenges to slavery. We also know that these portraits contributed to his celebrity and reputation, to say nothing of his wealth, as an abolitionist. And as marketing and commodities, they advanced and funded abolitionist activities, which of course served the interests of enslaved Blacks. But in the immediate, what did these photographic images of free Black activists do or mean for enslaved Black viewers? How often did they see these images? And if and when they did see them, did they find them heartening and inspiring or taunting and mystifying? Because we cannot assume the inclination or ability of enslaved Blacks to see or receive these images as free Blacks and or abolitionists did, or as we have. Moreover, how did these images work among or on the slaveholding class? A class that was steadily producing its own photographic archive of prestige. That included studio portraits of well-groomed, seemingly very proper Black women, whose primary function, in my opinion, was to visually signify and set off white power and privilege. Not surprisingly, and most appropriately, Douglass then and scholars since have focused on the violence of, to use Skip Gates' words, quote, the astonishingly large storehouse of racist stereotypes that circulated during and because of slavery. Images that racists and slavery apologists sanctioned, produced, deployed, and enjoyed. But we must recognize that abolitionists, a good many of whom we can assume were pro-Black, but not all, they not only used but produced psychically damaging and defining anti-Black photographic images. And this is where I'm going to show some disturbing graphic images. So I will say exactly what I'm going to. On Independence Day in 1863, within the context of the Civil War, Harper's Weekly, a publication self-described as, quote, a journal of civilization, ran a piece entitled A Typical Negro. Now I'm going to show a photograph with a wood engraving based on a hard photograph. And that piece included the quote, a portrait of included, to quote the text, a portrait of, quote, the Negro Gordon, who escaped from his master in Mississippi. And Gordon had just escaped to Union troops. And so the central image of that piece was a wood engraving of a photograph that was taken at the McPherson and Oliver studio in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Again, just 10 days after Gordon had escaped, which was sent to the journal by a surgeon of a Massachusetts volunteer regiment in Louisiana. And I'm going to show the actual photograph now. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen it. Entitled Scourge Back, you can see there's actually a couple photographs. The image showed the extensive scarring Gordon had as a result of being whipped. And when questioned about that whipping by those examining his back, George said he had been laid up in bed for 2 months, and he was so crazed with pain and fever that he tried to shoot his wife. In December of 1863, 6 months later, the New York Tribune received a letter to the editor which revealed that, quote, Friends of Freedom in New York and Boston have purchased carte de visite size photograph copies of the abused Negro as a faithful picture of the realities of slavery as it exists in the Southern states. And the letter's author then goes on to extol photography's significance as a truth-telling and potentially liberating force, writing, quote, through the mysterious agencies of the camera obscura, the most wonderful as well as beautiful results have been obtained. And it is the genius and perseverance of Daguerre that we of the 19th century today behold the outside view of the moon and the inside view of slavery. The letter's author is thankful for photography and especially for the photographs of Gordon. However, that these Friends of Freedom circulated images of Gordon to indict slavery did not negate the images as also functions, their function as also images of debasement, featuring as they do the denigrated and devalued Black body of a man whose scars were of greater significance than his face. 6 months later, the Journal of Civilization published a wood engraving of a photograph of emancipated slaves from Louisiana, which was sent to the magazine by George Hanks, an African-American colonel in the Union Army. Among those pictured is Wilson Chin, a 60-year-old man who had been enslaved on a sugar plantation for the last 40 years, where he was branded on his forehead with the initials of the slaveholder. The previous month, Hanks had taken that group of slaves, who were formerly enslaved, to a portrait studio in Philadelphia and then New York, where they posed for a series of carte de visite, which the National Freedmen's Relief Association then sold for $1 as part of a publicity campaign, the purpose of which was to raise money to educate former slaves. And I'm going to show you pictures of Chin from that article, which I find extremely hard. So the series included these incredible portraits of Wilson Chin, who is identified by the caption as a branded slave. And the images picture the about 60-year-old man, as it says, with and in, quote, instruments of torture used to punish slaves. The incongruency of the instruments of torture and Chin's dress, setting, and pose is visually shocking, which of course was the point. I cannot help when I look at this photograph to think of photography in a particular way at this point in time as it is related to African Americans. And this is something I'll speak to again in just a second. The portraits of Chin were engineered for the purposes of quickening the end of slavery and supporting the growing class of freedmen. But what must it have been for Chin to pose for those photographs? Again, who can say? But what I can say is that the photographs of Gordon and Chin circulated in the same domestic and international spaces, and at the same time as portraits that Douglass and Truth produced. The images commingled and competed as representations that defined Blackness and, yes, whiteness. And as the 19th century neared the 20th century, African-American public figures doubled down then on images of seated, still, silent, and sober Blackness. Figures like Booker T. Washington, who stepped in to fill the vacuum of Black leadership resulting from Frederick Douglass's death in 1895. Here, in 1875, just shy of 20 years old, Booker T. Washington was still standing. 20 years later, now the head of the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, he adopted the position expected of a man in his position. And it's clear that he and/or his publishers banked on this particular depiction to reflect and assert his significance, solemnity, intelligence, and self-discipline as a Black leader and educator. but for a few exceptions, he sits in the studio portraits that appear in the front matter of his many books. Admittedly, he has a bit of swagger in that first image, I think, and even a little bit of defiance. But from that point forward, until he stands up in 1911, 4 years before his death, he displays a fidelity to seated portraits in which he adheres to convention and appears less confrontational. In fact, he mostly faces the camera, and he even sometimes has a hint of a smile in his images, and he looks the viewer in the eye in most of the images. His comportment in these photographs reflects the balancing act of trying to signal his status without alienating, or worse yet, inflaming white members of the reading public, or more importantly, white benefactors supporting Tuskegee. And in the present day, it's this appearance of conformity or compromise that undermines the liberating power of the iconic photographs of Black leaders and activists. In the 19th century, are those that we celebrate continually in popular culture and then in the classroom. In the 19th century, studio portraits had cultural currency and political power as objective and truthful depictions. In the 21st century, when we can counterfeit just about any visual reality and thus are incredibly cynical about the images we do see, the staging of these studio portraits is more visible in that it grabs attention as artifice. And given the greater knowledge of and attention to the structural nature of racism, of oppression, those photographic elements that once conferred dignity on the Black figures pictured, the props, the clothing, and the settings, now become visible as implements of economic, cultural, and ideological systems that encourage and even require inequality and inequity. So while these portraits still connote significance, to some of us, they also read as warning signs and completely insufficient in a time when another archive of iconic images of Black people continues to grow. Thank you. Stop sharing here. If I can. Not let me do
Brilliant.
that.
Thank you, Brenna. May I offer a round of applause on behalf of all of our audience
Thank you.
for that timely, brilliant, and powerful lecture. Great. Thank you very much.
I am not being able to stop sharing once again. So let's see.